So I know that a couple of you have been, playing a lot of Skyrim, playing a lot of Oblivion, enjoying the game. Some of you maybe have completed everything there is to complete in both games, with your 1,000+ hours of gameplay time. And still, every now and again, you hear about the Bosmer, the Wood Elves, and their cannibalism. And you scratch your head and you go, where is that? Why do people keep talking about Wood Elves eating each other? Like, where is this? I have never seen this in my life in the games that I play. And there is a reason for that. You see, back in the good old days of the Second Era, Tiber Septim commanded a couple of, I think it was just actually one guy. We don't even know who the guy was. I'm pretty sure he was like an elf, if I remember correctly, but he asked of this elf, hey, could you do me this favor? I have this massive land now that I have conquered, and I need to know a little bit more about what's going on. I need you to go to Hammerfell. I need you to go to the eluded Dominion. I need you to go to, elsewhere, and I need you to tell me what it is like to live there. I need to know the people who I am ruling, and essentially that's what happened, and that's where the pocket edition of the Empire sort of came into place. It's a series of books that essentially tell the story of every single piece of land that exists, at least most of them that exist in Tamriel. And in one of these editions, this is the first edition, in one of these pamphlets, there was the eluded Dominion. And in this pamphlet, you get to experience what it was like to be this elf sort of exploring Valenwood and essentially recounting his tale, his experience. And in this experience, he talks about a lot of different and very interesting things. He talks about the Green Pact, he talks about the cannibalism. But now you might be wondering, Rhexx, why? Where do I see this? Where can I find this information? And you see, that is the problem. There has been 2 editions of this manual. The first one was released with Redguard, the good old school Elder Scrolls Redguard game. It came in, like when you. This is for those of you who are at least maybe 23, 24 years old plus. Back in those good old days when you used to go to GameStop and buy games, which I guess most people don't do that anymore. It was a pamphlet in the actual case, inside of the case of Redguard, and in it you would find all of this information. Of course, the information is not within the games. This was way back when. The 3rd edition of this pamphlet, which is, by the way, has nothing to do with the 1st edition, it's just completely new information, is found on the collector's edition of Oblivion. So none of this is actually found in the games, and that's probably why you haven't been able to hear much about the Bosmer and why are they cannibals and what's going on with that, right? It's just because you can't see them in the game, and it's inherently a problem, I suppose. But let's talk a little bit about it, because I'm sure that some of you are wondering what's that all about. And it's actually quite interesting. So the elf that traveled through Valenwood, he experienced a couple of very interesting things. He experienced that the Wood Elves were actually very primitive, very sort of primeval, very sort of bestial in their nature. They sort of lived in the trees. They didn't know how to cut stone. Their stone masonry was like non-existent. They didn't have any roads. They sort of carved bones into weapons instead of using iron and metal. He experienced this very, very sort of primitive looking civilization, and as he progressed through the civilization, trying to talk to these guys and experience, why this is the case, he discovered that back in the good old days, like literally when the world was being had recently just been created, there was this god, this entity, a she, called Ifre. Ifrit is nowadays known as the god of the now, or the spirit of the now. You know, you have the god of burials and sacred rites. You have the god of time. Well, this was the god of the present. And whatever that means, I guess it's sort of up for debate. We don't really have much on Ifrit other than, I suppose, what I'm about to tell you. But the Bosmer, the creatures that came about from Ifrit, and I guess I should probably talk a little bit about that, huh? So there are conflicting theories as to what happened. The creation story that the Khajiit tell, not even the Bosmer, the Khajiit, tell a story of this sort of entity. It doesn't necessarily say that it's Anu. You know how the Khajiits have like their own name for gods. I think they called it Nami. I don't remember very well. But it talks about Ifrit and Asura. And it talks about how Asura was holding a secret from Nami. And Ifrit told Nami of the secret, essentially betraying Asura. Nami, sort of like the god of gods, gave a present to Ifrit, said, hey, because you were being so good to me, I'm gonna curse the shit out of Asura. You know, her land, I'm just gonna destroy it. So she essentially created the deserts of elsewhere and created the jungles filled with poison and spiders and uninhabitable terrain, which became elsewhere. And then obviously Valenwood sort of stayed Valenwood, which was, I guess, great in a lot of ways. And she essentially taught Ifrit how to create the Bosmer. Now, the story that the Bosmer tells us is a little bit different. It talks about how the Bosmer were essentially, and we know what the elves believe in. We know that the elves believe that they come directly from the Aedra that sort of came and created the planet. They're literally their ancestors, right? Well, it talks about these Aedras, these entities, these old school like Elnofe creatures, not really knowing how to maintain an elvish form. They were being transformed from sort of elf into plants and then into animals. You know, sort of like a druid. They kept on changing forms without really being able to control it. And then Ifrit essentially taught them how to maintain an elvish form. And because of that, and because obviously of the love that the elves had for this god, they essentially made a vow, because Ifrit then turned into a tree, right? They made a vow that they would never harm the forest. They would never, and there's a lot of different like sections of this. My voice spiked there. I'm sorry. There are a lot of sections to this vow essentially, but the important ones are they vowed to never destroy any of the plants, that they would never eat any of the plants. You know, vegetables and fruits, that they would never use these plants to build anything, you know, houses or walls or weapons or anything for that matter. That they would never smoke anything that was herbal. So they actually smoke worms and grubs and shit like that, which is gross as hell, but you know, you do you, man. And they also vowed, and this is called the meat mandate, which is obviously the focus of this video. The meat mandate says that whenever a Bosmer kills an enemy, they are expected to eat that enemy within 3 days. And it also says that their family members can also help them in this regard, in eating the person. And so this is where the cannibalism sort of comes from. And on a sort of historical point of view, like, let's just imagine the world that the Bosmer live in. You live in this very dense forest. You're not allowed to scavenge for fruits or vegetables, and you're not allowed to, essentially the whole sort of spectrum of foods that you're allowed to eat is cut in half. Suddenly, the availability of, you know, elks and deer and game in general becomes a lot more important. You have to make sure that you don't ruin the ecosystem, because if you do, first of all, it's irresponsible. Second of all, you completely screw up the entire civilization if you don't have enough deer to eat. Cannibalism sort of becomes a little bit more like, well, we just sort of have to do this. However, based on the information that we have, I wouldn't say that Bosmer are cannibals, and this is something that I feel like gets thrown around too easily. You know, you always hear people saying, oh yeah, they're cannibals, they eat themselves, blah blah blah, you know, and it makes people envision this community of, alright, say that I am Steven, the Bosmer, and John over there died. Well, I guess I gotta eat his testicles. Like, that's not how it works. You don't, it's essentially, and as far as the information that we have, you really only eat yourself. I mean, you know, yourselves. You only eat other, I guess, let's call them smart entities. You only eat other humanoids, you know, elves or humans, if they are your enemy, essentially. There's really no reason to believe that it is anything more than that. So that was the first thing that I sort of wanted to talk about, because we really don't have any information that would suggest anything more than that. But also, I think it's very important to note, this was back in Tiber Septim times. This is the second era. This is a long time ago. I mean, thousands of years ago, right? Like, this might not be necessarily true anymore, and that's just in-game. I mean, think about it outside the game. This was released back when Redguard came out, right? The Bethesda that we have now is very different than the Bethesda of back then. I don't know, I'm not sure if that'll really hold up anymore. I mean, it's lore, right? Lore is lore, we have no reason to disregard it. It's just surprising to me that it hasn't been brought up anymore. I mean, when you look at the Wood Elves in Skyrim, in Oblivion, they are just normal people, right? And of course, they have been, the Bosmer that you see in Skyrim have grown in Skyrim and have been accustomed to Skyrim's, you know, traditions. Of course, they don't have that particular religious view that the Bosmer from Valenwood have. But I mean, nothing. We don't have anything. No, you don't have any Bosmer that goes, oh yeah, you know, I used to eat my children back in Valenwood, and I came here and I don't do that. Like, we don't get that at all, which I find very curious. Like, why that hasn't really been brought up anymore. And yeah, I do find that interesting. And the main reason why I find that interesting too is because I feel like the Bosmer must have evolved. I mean, imagine the Empire fighting the Aldmeri Dominion. Like, we know from back then that the High Elves from the Somerset Isles, they used to repair the roads from Valenwood because the Bosmer wouldn't, right? They didn't know how to manipulate stone. So the roads, like, they don't need roads, they can just travel through the woods, like, that's just what they do. So the High Elves would literally go to Valenwood and repair the roads for them, because the roads that were made by the Empire, by the way, for Valenwood, because they just didn't know how to. I imagine this place where essentially the Wood Elves contain like maybe 80% of the population, but everything is being made by other races. Which is a very important point of view, and this is something that I feel like a lot of people miss. The Green Pact that the Bosmer vowed to do for Ifre only prevents them from destroying the plants. It doesn't prevent the High Elves from destroying the plants. A High Elf could literally walk into Valenwood, cut down a tree, make a house, and then put the Bosmer to live in that house. There is nothing that prevents him from doing such. In fact, there are records that has actually happened before. We know that there are cities and towns in Valenwood, and that Bosmer live there, and we know that they are not made by the Bosmer. The pocketbook of the Empire literally states that Valenwood is interesting because it is the only a province where there are cities and towns that none of them have been made by the Bosmer. So it obviously insinuates that there are cities and towns, and insinuates that they hasn't been made by the Bosmer. But obviously we know that Bosmer live in there, so you know what I mean? Like, it's interesting to me. And so I really don't think that it's this really sort of primeval sort of I don't know, like dog eats dog world. I love when people say that. But I definitely envision a more prosperous sort of world down there. And it's interesting because this was brought up. I do a Dungeons & Dragons campaign where I DM and it is set in the world of the Elder Scrolls, and my players are in Valenwood, and there was the case where there was a disease that was spreading through this specific town in Valenwood called Western Woods, and it's very close to Fallenesti where the trees sort of rooted, the massive trees, and my players were, hey, so are they gonna eat the corpses? Like, I mean, they're sickly, so what are they gonna do? And I felt like I wanted to dispel some of these notions that that's how Valenwood probably works, because I really highly doubt that's how it works. I really don't think you just sort of eat your brothers and your sisters and your friends when they fall into disease or when they get killed by a monster. I really don't think that's how it works. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about it, especially because I know that this is not something that appears in the games, and I know that, you know, some of you just like playing Oblivion and Skyrim, not necessarily even ESO. You know, you just sort of do the single player games, and this is not in the single player game, so I wanted to maybe bring it up here and have a small conversation about it, maybe enlighten a few and maybe stir a conversation or two. And that's really all I wanted to do today. It's a pretty short video. Don't really have any more else to talk about this. I mean, there's other topics. I know that the wild hunt thing is a pretty interesting topic for me to talk about, and yes, there is such a thing as a wild hunt in the Elder Scroll world, and it's very close to what The Witcher is, but it's pretty surprising what you would find, the hidden secrets that you would find in Valenwood. There's a lot of old shamanistic magic in there that is very interesting, but maybe we'll talk about that at some other point. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed this short video. I'm gonna do some more videos this month. I've been neglecting you guys for far too long, and I'm trying to fix that. So, see you guys soon.